I'm going to unpause our video recording, and I'm going to jump into telescope in on some class business. Again, this is our last day of class for this ethics class project that we've had going on for what feels like forever now. Doesn't it feel like we've been at this forever? Since way back when in January. And I just want to say, if I don't get the chance at the end to say thank you, especially those of you here, but those of you later watching this recording, you know, it's been a challenge, hasn't it? It's still a challenge, but we found a way to keep going with our project and not give up on it. And I applaud you and I thank you for helping me to keep this going. So in terms of how we're going to wrap up, you know, this will be my final lecture today. And today I'm going to start off by taking any questions you might have with regard to the final exam review, and particular with regard to the last lecture on utilitarianism and the debate over utilitarianism. So I want to start there as usual. But then I'm going to go on to sketch out for you some of the big ideas that emerge out of the thinking of and writing of Soren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher of the early 19th century, and then finish up with the ideas and writings of Friedrich Nietzsche, the German-speaking Prussian philosopher working at the end of the 19th century. And those two will be our sort of the main goals of our final lecture here. With that said, you guys are probably, many of you, putting on the finishing touches for round 2 journals, maybe doing some extra credit. You want that to come in as strong as possible. That's due tomorrow by midnight as an upload onto Canvas. I do have the option, I can give you a couple of days of grace period on late submissions, but I do want to let you know that I'm running out of time to be understanding for late submissions, just backed up against the need to get it all graded at some point by next week. So do your best, and if you run into trouble, please reach out to me. I will post on Canvas some office hours since we go to final exams starting tomorrow. I'm going to post some times. I probably will post like 11 to 1 during the weekdays that I'll be available on Zoom if you want to pop in on me, or if you want to email me something about another time. Maybe we can find another time if those times don't work for you. But certainly Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and next Monday, I will be available on Zoom 11 to 1, and you can just pop in for studies or for questions or whatever concerns you have. So you're finishing up your round 2 journals. I'm currently working on a huge stack of journals from another class called Introduction to Philosophy. And in that class, I'm the fool that assigned so much work. I've got, you know, maybe about 250 pages to read of that. And then after that, your journals will become my priority then. So probably by the end of the week, I'll turn my attention to your journals. I won't be able to respond to each element with the level of comments as much as I would like, just for time. But I'll try in the comments section on Canvas to lay out the grades in such a way that you can see how I responded to individual items, reading reflections, conversation summaries, and the 2 entries and any extra credit, so that you can catch any kind of silly human mistakes I make. If I don't add up things the right way or I miss something, just take a look at it once the grade comes back, and that should give you enough to at least start raising some questions. And if frankly you just feel like, well, wow, I just wanted to hear a little bit more on this entry, you can hit me up with that too. I'll try my best to respond to that, given the rest of the stuff that we all have to do this next week. So what remains to be discussed in terms of our class business is our final exam. So today's our last class, and in the original schedule for final exams, our final exam was going to be set on Monday the 27th, which is the last day of final exams. Okay, I will make the final exam available so that you could take it if you want to in that window. So you could study all week and take it on the 27th at 12:30 to 2:30, basically in the right window. But what I think I'm going to do instead, just for more flexibility as well, is it's going to be like a 2-hour exam that'll be about 100 items. And I'll open it up Wednesday morning, which will be the day of my first ethics exam. And I will keep it open till Monday at midnight on the 27th. And you can decide what works best for you when you want to take it. So we got to find our silver linings where we can, right? There's a lot of this is challenging, but we got a few things that are working out good. I think, recordings of lectures is one, being able to attend class, asynchronously at a later time and follow the lecture, that's related. Being able to take exams at exactly the moment that works best for you within a larger window is another thing that's probably a bonus for us. So we'll embrace the bonuses and the silver linings where we can. So I think that's all the class business. Has anybody got anything else they want to raise or a question about any of that? Okay, so if you'd be ready to move on, then maybe a thumbs up from my black rectangles. Yes, boom, William, thank you for that. Okay, oh, heartening. So beautiful to see all those thumbs up in this moment. Okay. All right, then we can set class business aside and let's telescope in on the ideas. And as I said a moment ago, I want to start with asking you if you have any questions about the last lecture, or frankly, anything from the review that you've seen so far that you want to go back to before I try to put these finishing touch ideas on the table, working with Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. Okay, I'm sensing a certain wonderful eagerness to move on. I love it. Fantastic. Or perhaps you just haven't found the questions yet. That's okay. Hit me up in office hours or an email. But I love it because I'm excited to get to these ideas as well. So, let me talk to you as of late in kind of 3 parts here. I want to give you kind of an overview of where I think these thinkers fit into the big picture. And then I want to give you some ideas from Kierkegaard, and I want to finish up with some ideas from Nietzsche. So let me start off by saying that that in some ways this might seem a weird place to stop, because Nietzsche's early 19th century, Kierkegaard's early 19th century, and Nietzsche is late 19th century. And we're in the 21st century. So what's up with that? Well, some of that, I think, is due to the fact that what happens in the 20th and 21st century is largely a continuation of what we have seen. And so there's a lot of virtue theorists, who were influenced by Elizabeth Anscombe, who are going back to the ancient Greeks and kind of revivifying and giving new life to virtue theory in the 20th century. There are a number of theorists who have embraced the Humean perspective. I would draw attention to one in particular, that's a movement called feminist ethics, which is a broad umbrella of a number of thinkers who identify as feminist and then do some thinking about morality. But I see them as intellectually related to some of the work that Hume does. Very quickly, I'll say that there's an important work that comes out of the 1980s, I think it is. It's the work of Carol Gilligan. And she was at Harvard with a guy named Lawrence Kohlberg. And she wrote a book called In a Different Voice. And she really kind of began to define the idea in the late 20th century that men and women often think differently about morality. Now, that's not always true, but that there were some general psychological predispositions that seem related to either culturally engendered different views or maybe even biologically different views. And that this different voice, which was underrepresented in the male-dominated tradition, was more emphasizing feeling and connection and relationship and the duties that come out of the actual relationships and feelings in our lives. And that echoes, I think, Hume in a way, and de-emphasizing the kind of Kantian, pure rational derivation of duty, which many male theorists, especially like Lawrence Kohlberg at Harvard in the 20th century, he said, well, that's the pinnacle of the ethical approach. And his great student, Carol Gilligan, said, no, no, no. Actually, something much more Humean is the way a lot of women talk about morality, and that there's one's not better, they're complementary. So again, a continuation of Hume. There are social contract theorists, there are Kantians, and there are utilitarians. There's debates about all of it. There are those who have tried to find common ground between a number of the different modern moral theories. But in general, there has also been a recognition that the goal of the modern era, which was to respond to the modern crisis with a secular theory of morality, has produced no final winners. And this gets us towards what I would call the insights of postmodernism in philosophy, which will eventually be reflected in literature and art throughout the 20th century as well. And one of the themes I want to share with you about what I'm calling the postmodern today, which I think Kierkegaard and Nietzsche are laying the tracks for in the 19th century, is wrestling with the possibility, if not likelihood, that we may never arrive at a final theory of morality. We may never arrive at a final theory of a good life, and we may never arrive at a final theory of what it means to be a good person. And frankly, if we go slightly more broad for a second, we may never arrive at a final theory of even reality itself, because science, by the time you get to the 20th century, and if maybe you were astute enough in the 19th century, you could have always seen that the methodology of science itself doesn't aim at once and for all truths. It aims at the best theories to explain the most data. And what we've seen in the 20th century in particular is that the theories of reality have collided in major ways. You know, Newtonian mechanics has collided with quantum theory, has collided with Einsteinian relativity. And maybe we'll never arrive at what Einstein supposedly died seeking, which was some kind of overarching umbrella theory. I forget, there's a good word for that, blanking on it in this moment, but some kind of theory of everything. And in some sense, this is the roots of postmodernism. After the modern, postmodern, this era of philosophy, and maybe this era in which we are living, is an era where we are coming to grips with the possibility and maybe likelihood that we will not find the final answers that we seek. We will not find the clarity that Kant so desperately sought. And not just Kant, right? Because in some ways, as Camus, the French-Algerian Nobel Prize-winning literary figure, Albert Camus will write in his more philosophical essays, he'll suggest this moment, particularly the 20th century, is an absurd moment to be a human. Because what we want most is understanding. Given the kind of creature we are, we want two things. We want understanding and we want lasting connections. And living in the 20th century is to live in the time where we wrestle with the possibility that there will be no final understanding and that relationships will always be evolving and never be static and given. And so he says, we live in an absurd moment of history, a moment where those things that we have been biologically evolved to most want, we're coming to grips with the possibility that we will never have. Again, this manifests in all kinds of different ways. The theater of the absurd, the French theater movement in the middle of the 20th century, you know, Waiting for Godot, you know, by Samuel Beckett, so much art, the empty canvases of modern painting, some of the sculpture. I mean, there's a lot of echoes of this that I'm sharing with you today. And I think in their own way, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche are the first to put their finger on the pulse of this moment that is unfolding. And so I've said to you in the lecture notes and even in the review that Kierkegaard and Nietzsche are for me the roots of existentialism. I actually would like to speak to you a little bit more carefully about that. Existentialism particularly refers to the views of Simone de Beauvoir, very famous French philosopher, and her life partner, Jean-Paul Sartre, right? Both graduating from the very famous Sorbonne in Paris in the middle of the 20th century, both living through World War II, and both becoming super famous philosophers in the middle of the 20th century and the 60s, like rock stars, really. And they had a philosophy of existence that is called existentialism. But more broadly, they are a part of something that Kierkegaard and Nietzsche start, that if we were more careful, I would have called existential philosophy, or philosophies of existence. And so what's happening in this postmodern context is the realization that the history of philosophy has sought wisdom that is timeless about being a human. And I don't want to give up on that. I think there's something interesting to us swapping notes on being human and benefiting from the religious and literary traditions of the last few thousand years to shine light on some of the timeless, or I might say, archetypal challenges of being a human being. But with that said, what Kierkegaard and Nietzsche are going to call out before anybody else does is that there are challenges of being a human in a moment of history that layer over the top of these timeless, biologically oriented, psychologically oriented challenges as well. And that particularly in the 19th and 20th century, what we're discovering is that we have stumbled upon some new moral challenges, some new ethical challenges. And at the heart of it is how to have a good life in this new moment that we've called postmodern. And so now I want to go back, circle back around and remind you, when we said the postmodern, what we said is the moment when we may be willing to wrestle with the too many qualifications there, let me say it more simply. The postmodern moment is when we wrestle with the possibility or the likelihood that we will not be able to arrive at final answers. And at the same time, though, the modern age, if you recall, culturally, and particularly in terms of its political philosophies, was influenced by natural law theory and the idea of the natural human rights of individuals. And humanism was reborn in the modern age, and it expanded into a new expression of individualism, the championing of the dignity of the individual human being. And I want you to look at the way in which these two cultural trends, the philosophical postmodern and the cultural and political modern celebration of the dignity of the human individual, are going to come together in a strange challenge. You and I have to construct our lives, answers to the age-old questions of how to have a good life and how to be good people, in a moment when we are more politically, socially, and economically free than humans have ever been before in history. And at the same time, when humans are coming to grips with the possibility that we may not have final answers. In some sense, this is the perfect storm of postmodernism. This is the perfect storm that Nietzsche and Kierkegaard are going to call out, right? It's the combination of unprecedented levels of individual freedom and choice and opportunities to make life what we want it to be. Combine that freedom and power brought to you through science, right? With this, and again, if you accept it, this philosophical maturation, right, over the 2,500 years of the tradition of philosophy itself, in which we have ironically matured to the realization that maybe we're not equipped to know the once and for all answer. Maybe because there isn't one, or maybe just because we're not equipped to know it. But both will amount to the same. We're more free than ever, and we're confronted by more uncertainty than ever. This is another way to understand the absurdity of our existential condition. And what the existential philosophers are going to do, including the existentialists, Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre, but all the others, Karl Jaspers, Martin Heidegger, right? So many are going to call out is we live in a moment, and part of being a human, especially in the 19th and now 20th century, is the realization that the challenge of being a human comes in part from the moment in which you're being a human. And while we stand on the shoulders of giants, it has led us to this ironic place of the collision of choice and freedom with deep uncertainty. And so, in general, what unites the existential philosophers, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, de Beauvoir, Sartre, Jaspers, Heidegger, a whole array, just a whole cast of existential philosophers, is they all speak to this challenge in their own way. And there are some themes, and I've already sort of highlighted them. The theme of how to be an individual in a moment of radical freedom and radical choice. When, for hundreds of thousands of years, if you accept the evolutionary biological account, we evolved in groups. Of course, we always lived in some sense as individuals, but as Nietzsche will say very provocatively, the individual is born very recently in history. And what he means by that is the individual consciousness living the examined life that Socrates challenged us to live is born, is reborn in the modern, and brought to fruition very recently in these political and economic experiments like classical liberalism, where we have human rights, and capitalism, where we let free markets govern things instead of the aristocracy. This is the birthplace. This is the soil in which the consciousness of the individual experiment has really been created. It's a powerful, powerful thing to wrestle with there. But the irony, right, of that is that the individual then is a relatively recent phenomenon. And our psychology and emotionality evolved as much more of sheeple than people. Much more of, as Kierkegaard would call it, crowd animals, or as Nietzsche will call it, herd animals, right? We normally are born into a group, and we get the cultural lens, and we enact a role which is given to us. And we enact it in our whole lives because it gives meaning to our lives and it gives identity to ourselves. And yet now we have thought and fought our way to a moment where we are free to live examined lives, as Socrates challenged. But we can also begin to see why Socrates got killed for that, because the typical psychology of the human being resents the burden that this puts on him or her. Freedom is beautiful, but as Sartre puts it very beautifully, freedom is a burden which we carry up a hill like Sisyphus, over and over and over again. And toward what end? We don't even know. So the challenge of being the individual in this time of unprecedented choice, given the psychology of the last few hundred thousand years, presents quite the new existential challenge. And in particular, it confronts us all with the possibility, and dare I say, likelihood, that we have all put on a role during our enculturation process. And at some level, this is like an outfit that's not going to fit eventually. We have been asked to fulfill certain societal expectations. And these roles don't represent who we are as concrete individuals. There is no playbook for Lee to be Lee, or Marlene to be Marlene, or Lorenzo to be Lorenzo. There is a value in swapping notes on how to be a human. Don't throw that out. But there's no formula for Lee to be Lee, no formula for Marlene to be Marlene, and no formula for Lorenzo to be Lorenzo. And whether you're living a secular life or a religious life, it doesn't matter. You still live in a moment of radical freedom where you're confronted with the new challenge of inventing yourself. And this challenge of keeping it real, as we sometimes half jokingly and lightheartedly talk about, the challenge of authenticity is a serious challenge, because along with the challenge of authenticity comes the challenge of being alienated by the crowd or the herd when you dare to dance like an individual on the dance floor of life. If you make the moves your own, nobody's going to recognize them. They're going to call it weird. And that moment where we all walked into the middle school or high school lunchroom and confronted that painful choice of which table to sit at.
How does that differ with religion?
Say that again, John?
How does that differ with religion?
It doesn't. As you'll see, as Kierkegaard will talk about, it doesn't. The same challenge exists within religious lives and religious institutions. The challenge of the modern individual to be true to him or herself exists within religious institutions and outside of them. But Kierkegaard, who is a religiously oriented thinker, is going to call this out particular. So pause that and wait for Kierkegaard's answer on that. I think he's going to give you a lot more on this. What I'm just still trying to do, I'm finishing up this first part of the lecture before I get to Kierkegaard. I'm just trying to give you a sense for existential philosophy. And I'm giving you the sense that the challenge is to be something kind of new, something that we talk a good game about, which is being an original or unique or genuine individual. But we probably underestimate how psychologically, emotionally, and ethically difficult it is to really risk the very real alienation that individuals often face when they dare to be themselves. Just ask Socrates.
Right? What if somebody's been like saying having a hard time with being themselves, but then that's the last option they have? So what would I say about that? I don't know.
Well, Nietzsche and Kierkegaard are going to make a lot of their reputation as thinkers, not during their lifetime, but into the 20th century. People are going to finally sort of get what they were talking about by recommending different versions of how do you embrace this challenge? What are some of the best ways, most effective ways to live a good life in the moment of this challenge? So this is how they fit into the ethical tradition, but how they also represent the postmodern expression of this ethical tradition. And Kierkegaard will use the language of God and faith because he takes that very seriously. Actually, both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche grew up very religiously. Kierkegaard will maintain the language of God and faith to talk about the challenge. Nietzsche will reject it very strongly. And that's partly why I want to bring you both, because some of you will resonate more with the language of Kierkegaard and some will resonate more with the language of Nietzsche. But what I am trying to provocatively suggest is that whatever the vocabulary is, they're speaking to the same challenge. And let's add one more layer before we get on to Kierkegaard. We are embracing this challenge of being the concrete individual in a moment in history. At a time when science and the modern crisis has also brought on kind of a new awareness, and that is that it's possible this is your one shot at a life. Now, I don't know that. I would just sort of admit my own agnosticism here, because I don't want to pretend to know something I don't. I don't know what happens after we die. But what Epicurus said 2,300 years ago has just become more plausible in the age of science. And that is, maybe whatever this mystery is that we are, it dissipates when we pass away. And if that's the case, then the pressure to enact a life that is true to who I am, right? The pressure is increased in some respects. If I honestly wrestle with my mortality in this postmodern moment, then the stress, or what the existential philosophers often call the angst or the anxiety, or Kierkegaard uses the word agony, right? The pain of existence that leads Camus to say the fundamental question is to be or not to be. Once you realize that you're like Sisyphus rolling your rock to the hill with your choices, the question becomes to be or not to be. All of them are going to argue to be. Okay, let's get that straight. Let's be clear about that. None of them argue that we should give up. But all of them argue that we have to take an honest look at, we all have fears, but fears are a little different from anxiety, because fears have specific causes. Sometimes we know them, sometimes we don't, but fears have specific causes. Anxiety, the existential philosophy would say, is tied to the condition of existence. And you and I live in a time of anxiety, right? We live in a time of heightened anxiety because we've cut the individual loose from the narratives that used to give the individual its role and its meaning and its place and its values. We've cut it loose with freedom and choice. And we've said we've celebrated this, but we've done it in a moment of great uncertainty, even absurdity, as I developed it before. And that means that if you are awake at all, then you're going to feel a little stress. And I want to leverage that point to say, if you have periods in your life where you feel stressed out by the uncertainty of existence, you're not broken. There's nothing wrong with you. You're keeping it real. The stress of existence is a normal reaction to this historical moment. Now, how you deal with that stress matters, but don't treat it as if there's something wrong with you if you have these existential crises at times in your life. Especially moments where you confront particularly big and life-defining choices. So let me pivot right there into Kierkegaard, because Kierkegaard, raised in a very conservative religious Protestant Christian culture in Copenhagen, Denmark, in the first part of the 19th century, raised in a very wealthy, successful family, had a lot of pressure to follow in his father's footsteps and go into the family business. But Kierkegaard, an educated person, caught a little bit of that examined life bug early on, and he got really fascinated by theology and religion and culture. And he realized he didn't want to make that choice. And he realized that if he'd put on the business suit of his very successful father, that it would be in some sense a lie. But what Kierkegaard goes on to do with his writing and his life is explore the implications of this realization that a lot of us are confronted with choices. We know maybe what's not the right choice for us, but it's very hard to know what is the right choice, particularly when it comes to big things like, should I stay in college? Should I work more? If I stay in college, what degree should I get? What career should I go for? Should I try to go deeper into this relationship? Should I have children? Should I start a family? These are the big choices of a real subjective existence, of a subject of a life. These are the choices that confront us all. And they will define our lives. But they are choices which are, as Kierkegaard will say, criterion-less, meaning without adequate criteria to make the choices objectively. Okay, now of course there's data on things like what career should you choose, but that's data that you might ask, where might I have a stable career? Where might I have a career that provides for me financially? But guess what? That might not be the most meaningful question. Maybe the most meaningful question in this postmodern moment is, what is the life that would be most important to me given who I am as a unique person? And the news might be bad, right? Because maybe you want to be a poet and everybody in society is going to tell you, oh, bad idea. Get your degree in accounting. Get your nursing degree and take care of the elderly. That way you're always going to have a job, right?
Okay,
Go
what
into
if it's true?
computers.
What if it's true?
But what if it's true, right? What if you are a poet?
No, what if it's not me? Like, what if you're not a poet like everybody else is saying?
Okay, well, here's the challenge. Only you know.
Okay,
And
what
when
if
you say no, you got to put it in scare quotes, because it's impossible to have anything like objective truth with regard to knowing yourself. And yet nobody else can give you more about yourself than you can. And so this is your existential condition that Kierkegaard is diagnosing. You have to figure out you. You have to do you. And again, we talk like that all the time. Easy to say, harder to do. Especially since you are an evolving creature. The target is moving. And so when it comes to which relationship to commit to, whether or not to do, like have children or not, that's a big one. That's a big one. A lot of people, stumble and make mistakes into their way into that one. That would be very normal. In some sense, Kierkegaard would say that's a little suspicious. A lot of people are throwing choice away. And you know why? Because choice is really terrifying if you're honest about it. But that doesn't make it anything other than the main challenge. The main challenge is honestly embracing these choices, even though there's not a big enough computer and there's not enough data to feed into that computer to tell you who to love and to tell you who you should commit to. Objective truth, whether it's from computers, science, or even the objective moral theories of Kant or the theories of, they've got their place, right? But none of them can tell Lee how to be Lee or Marlene how to be Marlene, right? Or Lawrence how to be Lawrence. None of them can tell John how to be John. Marielle how to be Marielle. Because you are the first of your kind. If we take this seriously, you are the first version of you. Now you're a human. Don't underestimate that. Swap notes with the other humans as we've done all semester. But remember that the last slice here that everybody wants to champion, everybody wants to focus on, everybody wants to reject Plato because how can Plato tell me how to be me? Okay, I get it. We live in the moment where we talk a good game about being an individual. But Kierkegaard says, let's take this really seriously for a second. There's never been a you. There'll never be another you. You are a completely unique work of art. Now there you go, make yourself. These criterionless choices that will define your existence might be your one existence. They're agonizing for this reason. They bring an anxiety with them for this reason. And most people don't like it, okay? And that's totally normal. We don't like our pain, right? But guess what? If you avoid your pain, it's just going to come back to bite you. If you suffer a loss and you have extreme grief and you pave it over with enough alcohol or enough denial or staying busy for enough years, eventually, it is my contention, it will come back and you'll deal with it, or it will break you eventually. It will limit you eventually in your ability to explore life. And Kierkegaard's saying the same thing about the existential anxiety of living in this moment. You will confront this or you will regret that. And most people avoid it, and they most avoid it by joining the crowd. And one of the most pernicious versions of the crowd, one of the most ironic versions of the crowd for Kierkegaard is the religious crowd. Because for Kierkegaard, religion, and particularly even Christianity, contains some of the most potent symbols that we could turn to for help in finding salvation. Listen to that language. But yet what most people do is a slightly hypocritical version, sometimes much more significantly hypocritical version, of hiding in a crowd and thinking themselves embracing the challenge of existence by going to the right building on the right day of the week in the right clothes and marrying the right person and going through the right rituals and saying the right words. And Kierkegaard says, the crowd is never the solution for how to be an individual. And the religious crowd is an especially attractive, but yet ironically harmful version of this. And so he becomes a very prominent critic of institutionalized religion. I heard this said beautifully by the Catholic Christian mystic, Brother David Steindl-Rast, who's Austrian. Look him up, totally worthwhile. And what he says is that in all the religious traditions, what happens is they burst forth as volcanoes, and they essentially are teachings that bring people to life, but over time they become rock and they sediment us. Institutionalized spirituality becomes dead religious tradition. And I hope you can hear the subtlety there. He's not knocking religion, right? But he's knocking the human tendency to turn spiritual teachings which enliven us, which bring us to the mystery of existence. He's saying there's a tendency for humans to oversimplify them and to hide within these oversimplifications, hiding from the very life that they think they're embracing. And so Kierkegaard is going to try to diagnose this situation by describing what he calls 3 phases that we might go through in life. Now, both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche are very astute observers of human psychology. That's a large way that they become very famous as thinkers. And so I hope that some of this will sound like, yeah, that's an interesting thing I never thought of. I should try to observe that myself and others, okay? But please know that neither Kierkegaard nor Nietzsche thought they were putting forth any absolute truths here, right? Like they're too postmodern for that, right? They're too aware of the moment for that. What they're going to try to do is call some things out, make some observations, and invite you to the challenge the way Socrates had so long ago. Not tell you what to do, but try to wake you up to the question. And so Kierkegaard does this by describing what he calls the 3 phases on life's way. Now, again, one thing very frustrating about Kierkegaard is, like Plato, he writes with different characters, and he gives these different characters different positions, and you never really know what is Kierkegaard's position. I think that's a little schizophrenic on the one hand. It's also very much on purpose, right? Because like Plato, in some sense, it's an homage to the back and forth, but like Socrates, Kierkegaard is calling out that what I need you to do is wake up to the challenge. I can't tell you how to answer the challenge. And so I'm going to describe to you the 3 phases on life's way. But please know, he talks about even these 3 phases very differently. Not everybody goes through them. Not everybody goes through them in this order. But here's one possibility of a life that will raise some things to think about. 3 phases that we might consider an individual going through in response to what? In response to the central agonizing experience of an individual, which is choice, criterionless choice. Okay, so he says one thing that's very normal for young people as they begin to mature into adults is that they might wake up to the complexities of existence, and they might wake up to the challenges of choice. In particular, if they break free of some of the societal structures, let's say their educational system, but they haven't yet landed on careers and marriages and families yet. There's often a phase that Kierkegaard would call the aesthetic phase. And in the aesthetic phase, we are often tempted to live a little bit like Cyrenaic hedonists. It's often a sort of a breaking away from the structures of culture, which produces its own kind of pendular momentum away from the structures of society towards a kind of an experimentation with life, where we're super enthused as young beings with pleasure and beauty and adventure. Again, not everybody does this, but it's recognizable, I would say. And Kierkegaard says, this is in some ways joyful. There's something right about this, but there's also something deeply dishonest about the way most people inhabit this attitude towards choice, because the way they enact their choices is as if the choices don't matter. They embrace things, they drop them midway, they just lose turn their attention on a dime, they're distracted by the next relationship, and they in some sense seem phobic of commitment. And so he suspects that psychologically what's going on for many people who are living a kind of a hedonist lifestyle in this way is that they are distracting themselves with pleasures from the more serious challenge of making a life.
What if it's stressful?
What's stressful?
Everything you just said.
Right. Well, in some sense, that's what he's saying. It would be very psychologically normal to be stressed out by choice and the responsibility you have for your existence. And so one typical response, he calls the aesthetic response, is to overindulge in a hedonistic lifestyle. Probably more Cyrenaic, right? It's more spontaneous. It's a live for the moment. And what he suspects is that that's the attempt to pretend that choice doesn't matter. But the problem with this approach is that choice does matter, and that will catch up with our psychology eventually in a couple of different ways, probably, right? One, we're going to feel unfulfilled in a couple of ways eventually. We're going to get bored with the next road trip, the next 2-for-1 drink special, the next fake laughter, hang out with new people, small talk kind of thing. So we get bored with ourselves and with our lives, or we start to feel irresponsible, and we start to suspect that the project of a life has not been embraced and that we haven't really chosen anything significant. And so we start to feel a kind of a meaninglessness in these whimsical pleasure-based choices. Boredom or meaninglessness and irresponsibility begin to creep in. And so what happens for many, not for all, there's no necessity right to this, just one way a life might play out that draws attention to certain psychological tendencies that we use to respond to choice and the stress, as John points out, of choice that we're trying to avoid, right? What happens for some who get bored or unfulfilled by the aesthetic approach is that the pendular momentum will attract us again. The pendulum will swing, and we will abandon the fly-by-night spontaneity of hookup culture and drinking and road tripping and crashing on couches for the attempt to find some structure and some principles and to shape ourselves over time into a more serious person, leaving behind the frivolity of our youth and embracing the seriousness of adulthood, structure, plans, duties, and principles. And Kierkegaard specifically references Kant here, and he calls this the ethical phase of life. And what he means is that the ethical phase of life, as he defines it, is the phase of life where we try to find some principles and structures to live by in order to produce something with our lives and feel more fulfilled. And there's something to that. There's something very powerful in that. And yet there's a problem in that. Because what often happens, as we talked about before, the volcano becoming the rock of lava, right, is that the structures and principles that we decide to embrace, I don't know what, at 21, 23, 27, 36, whenever we embrace, life with this seriousness, at some point, Kierkegaard says, we may wake up to the fact that as a truly unique individual, no one and evolving creature, truly unique and evolving individual, no one structure or set of principles will ever carry us to our grave. And we're going to outgrow the structures and principles that we embrace. And as we do, we're going to ask the tougher questions. Why did we embrace that structure? Why did we embrace those principles in the first place? And as we do, our ability to commit to structure and principle is going to get undermined. Now, again, not everybody experiences this the same way. Some people put on the suit of seriousness and die that way.
When do you know when it's ever enough?
Well, knowledge, this subjective kind of knowledge Kierkegaard is kind of calling forth, is something much more akin to the leap of faith. And that's where he's going to return to this language from religion. It's nothing like the knowledge of science. It's nothing like the theoretical claims of philosophers. Subjective knowledge is more like a daily leap of faith into the mystery of existence and into the mystery of who you are. But if you want to have the best chance at finding a fulfilling existence, you better embrace that uncertainty. You better embrace that giant mystery. Call it what you want. I think Kierkegaard calls it God.
So instead of trying to avoid it, you should like make it as your friend or your ally or something.
Right. You need to realize, and this is some language that Kierkegaard uses, you need to realize that this will be an ongoing, never-ending, and daily battle. So you need to don the armor of a knight, a K-N-I-G-H-T. And more important than the armor is you need to put on the psychology of the quest. You need to make life your adventure and your quest. And if you can approach life like that, not whimsically rejecting the importance of choice, but not also pretending that any one structure is going to take you there, or any one truth or any one theory is going to take you there, any one value system, then you will have the strength and courage for the daily challenge of the quest of existence. And Kierkegaard calls this the religious phase. Some people enter the authentically religious phase. Now again, remember, be careful with that language, because to follow the right crowd is another lie. That's another probably version of an ethical lie. Like, and I'm sorry if this sounds, I don't mean it to be disrespectful, but Kierkegaard has this very strange theology within Christianity that's been very influential in the 20th century, where he takes Christianity and in some sense sort of upsets Christianity and all religion with this theology. Because what he says is that the truly religious person, especially the authentic Christian, is never saved by a crowd and is never saved by what somebody did 2,000 years ago. The authentic religious person, and the authentic Christian in particular, is the one that combines the eternal mystery of existence with a moment in history and produces the adventure of an individual life. And salvation is found there at the center of the cross, which is a terrifying death of sorts. You give up on the aesthetic life and you give up on the ethical life to bring the both of them together, leaving behind the lie parts of them, and you take seriously the attempt to construct structure and principle, but you also take seriously the spontaneity and individuality and uniqueness of the evolving moment. And only then do you embrace the spirit of what he thinks of as Jesus as a symbol and become a true Christian.
Professor?
And embrace the leap of faith. Question, Lee? Comment?
Yes, I think you lost us a little bit, because I think that what John was asking is when you are describing those phases, he was asking, how do we know that we are going through those phases? That's what he meant. Mm-hmm. So how do we know that we are going through those phases?
Right. Again, there's not much of a firm answer, because there's no scientific thermometer, right, that you can put in and say, oh, here's where you are and here's what you need to do. In part because you're a completely unique individual living in a new moment of history. But the best we can do as an existential philosopher is call out some commonly observed mistakes that people make. And then you have to ask yourself, am I making this mistake? And only you can answer that question. Am I distracting myself with pleasures? Am I pretending and hiding in structure? Am I pretending and hiding in something that purports to be the one and final truth or set of principles? If so, you might be hiding in the aesthetic phase or the ethical phase. And Kierkegaard thinks your best bet to a meaningful existence is to transcend both the aesthetic and the ethical and embrace the truly challenging, we might say spiritually challenging, right, life that is to become more than you've been so far continually.
Is that when you ask yourself to be or not to be?
Well, I would think that the question of to be or not to be will come in the sort of moments of despair where we're not sure we can get out. Like, and there's a bunch of ways to arrive at there, right? Nietzsche will talk to this a little bit more directly, but maybe for a Kierkegaardian, we find ourselves deep, deep caught within the aesthetic life. Maybe so much so that we realize we have a problem with some substance or with sex or with something. Or maybe we find ourselves deep, deep in the ethical, where we find ourselves wedded to a job that at one point seemed really important, or a role or a set of values that at one point seemed really important, but now feels empty. And maybe in that moment of despair, we would confront the philosophical question, Camus says, of the 20th century, which is to continue or to give up, to be or not to be.
I feel like you would be under the influence of fear, like you don't know which direction to go. You don't feel like if you go right or left, you don't know if it's beneficial.
Yeah, agreed, John. And I think that this is not like happy philosophy, right? Like this is not philosophy for children, right? But I think it probably resonates with some of you about this moment of stress that we live in, not only this very moment, but in general, the 21st century, what we've called the postmodern challenge. You know, this is the age of anxiety, and not surprisingly, it's the age of suicide. There are more people dying of suicide in the world than ever before. And I think the numbers are actually pretty shocking. Like more people die of suicide than many other types of like diseases. You'd be shocked, right? Or maybe you wouldn't if you know the data.
But there's a lot of homeless people too.
Say that again?
There's a lot of homeless people too.
Absolutely. You know, so be careful about what projects you just throw away, you know, like jobs and families. And let's be honest, let's use a little bit of the human wisdom that we've harvested over the semester, right? Remember the doctrine of the mean. Remember external goods from Aristotle. Remember Epicurus saying that the most important thing you could do would be to find a community that supports you in your journey. If you are in the midst of despair, which is very real, don't stay alone.
Look at the community around here. Most of them are like, I'm not gonna try to be racist, but they're like mostly for white people. And then you have us, the black people, we're out here in the area.
Yeah. And I think, okay, that's an interesting comment because I think you've added now a layer of race and class and gender and homophobia and all the cultural challenges.
Right? Religion too.
And religion too. Well, so what you got to do as part of your solution, perhaps, John, is find those people who are aware of these challenges and who will still nurture you when you step out onto the dance floor of life and dance like nobody else.
But
instead of the people who will be haters.
But they know that. But some people know if it's serious, they know who they are. So they know it's not gonna affect them. It's gonna affect the poor,
the more vulnerable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or poor.
Okay, you know, you've actually stumbled on a really powerful connection between existential philosophy and what Sartre does in the 20th century when he ties this to political philosophy. He says, you know, these external goods that Aristotle talked about, you know, like everybody needs a little health care now and again, and everybody needs a place to live, and everybody needs some
Obama
food.
did it. Everybody didn't like it. Well, the people who didn't like it, they did. I guess
Well, I don't want to go too far off into the political philosophical debate of the United States in the 20th century, but I think your connection is a really fair connection to make. And there's a very interesting conversation to be had about how do we give people the tools to react to this moment. And, you know, I think Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, and let's be clear, they both died very lonely and very unhappy.
But who decide who gets to give out the tools?
Well, the beauty of a democracy in theory is that we do.
Well, not we. Like you say we, like as in everyone else or every citizen, but you have Trump. I'm not gonna say Trump, but you have a president. Let's say you have a president that depicts whether it goes either that way or left or right.
Okay, again, I need to pause this just so I do some justice to Nietzsche. But again, I like your direction. It's a great line of thought. And more generally, if we don't just pick on the current president, right, we've got a problem in democracy of maybe money influencing democracy more than individual votes influencing democracy. And we've got a deeper problem in democracy, which is that we vilify education and we vilify philosophy as if it doesn't matter. But how meaningful is democracy if we're not educated and philosophically awakened? Right.
But school, look at school now. School is not really teaching you anything like high school. I'll say high school didn't really teach me a lot until I really got to college and realized like you can't fake this shit. Like you have to be serious.
Well, John, again, another great real world connection. And I wish, and in fact, let's meet in office hours if you guys want to discuss this further, because I think this is a super, super important direction that this conversation and these ideas could take us. How do we then transfer? And remember, I told you this early in the term, define your theory of reality, get your ethics, and then you're ready to do your political philosophy. And in here, in some very real way, John is saying, man, you're hitting me with some ideas that sound right, but I'm frustrated because it's going to be very difficult to respond to these ideas in this political philosophical climate. And so, you know, here's the good news. We don't have a king in theory, right? That's the beauty of the experiment of democracy that's reborn from ancient Greece. In theory, you can overthrow your leaders if they're not actually leading you. But let me go to Nietzsche now.
Now you have it impeached, like you could basically say impeachment doesn't work now.
Well, you could, and we'll see what happens in November, because then you get an election, and that's the beauty of cyclical elections.
Kings. So kings are like, and then back in the medieval times, or weren't they different? Like all they really cared about it was like their country, like how to make it better, until they started getting selfish for themselves, and then started creating businesses and stuff like that.
Well, capitalism doesn't invent selfishness, but it does champion it in some interesting ways. Again, pause. I got to go to Nietzsche or I won't get to his most powerful ideas. Lee, real quick.
Yes, real quick. I just wanted to tell John that that you living in a country, you know, as much as you think that things are wrong with it, you have the best opportunities compared to other places in the world. So all you need to do is take advantage. Yeah. All you need to do is just take advantage of it. And for a community, all you need is 1 or 2 per people, you know? A community doesn't have to be like a lot of people like you think. And it's possible, you know? You can do it if you want to, if you concentrating on the right things, on the right goals.
Again, let's meet in office hours, because great ideas. In Intro to Philosophy, we take it a little further in terms of the political philosophy that we maybe need to think about to make this more tangible. But now I need to pivot in the time that remains to get to our second thinker, because our first thinker used the language of faith and the symbol of Jesus to enact a kind of a description of the challenge of the moment. But Nietzsche is infamously going to be the philosopher who pronounces the death of God. And so we've got to try to make sense of how is this guy talking about the same thing with such drastically different language. Okay. I'm going to give you the short version of his life so I can get to his ideas, but his life's pretty interesting. He was basically a prodigy student, very genius young student. So much so that when he was in graduate school, his very famous professors recommended him for work at universities before he even finished his degree. Imagine if you were studying medicine and the world's top hospitals tried to hire you already before you finished your medical degree. And you said, well, wait, I haven't finished. And they said, we don't care. Just come work here, research here, and teach here. And that's what happened to Nietzsche. He started off very religiously, but he quickly moved broadly to the study of all different cultures. Very, very deep scholar of literature, of culture, of philosophy, and of ancient languages, a genius of languages. And so he could read all of the doctrines of cultures in their original, and he had the mind to remember it and synthesize it.
Did they have mathematics back then or no?
Oh, absolutely. And he had a period of time of sort of indulging in the sciences and being a champion of the sciences. But in general, he stayed on the humanities side of things.
Okay, I understand.
And religion and philosophy. But he went off to teach at very prestigious university in Basel in Switzerland, and it didn't go well. And there's a bunch of complicated reasons for that: health problems, psychological problems, probably too smart really to even mix with people very well. That was some of it. But he ended up really going crazy and died kind of sad and alone, and it was very pathetic. But before he died, in a very short life, he produced some works that ended up changing, a lot of Western philosophy. And so I'm going to give you a sketch of his critique of the tradition that we've been exploring. He says, basically, if you look at the last few thousand years of human cultures, you will find a kind of a balancing act between value systems that are actually tied to two different economic and political and social groups that we might call the haves and the have-nots. So the values of culture, and this is a very Marxist point, tend to reflect where you are in the economic structures of society. And he calls one of these value systems the master morality, and he calls the other value system the slave morality. And he says most human cultures are kind of a healthy balance of master and slave morality. And master morality is the value system of those in charge. And because they're in charge, they tend to have a certain metaphysical and ethical outlook on life. They think that this lifetime matters, and that they think they can make a difference that is meaningful in this lifetime. Master moralities are life-affirming and self-affirming.
Those are the people that are in like humanity, or studying humanity, you said, right?
Well, Nietzsche studies humanities. He's basically saying culture as a whole, if you look at the history of culture, which a mind like Nietzsche could, you're going to see these patterns. And one of the patterns is that the powerful tend to champion the value of this life and champion the value and efficacy of the human individual. Not every individual, but the strong individuals in particular. Master moralities. Now, slave moralities, and this is born out of powerlessness, Nietzsche says, resent the power of the masters and resent the powerlessness that they feel. And so they often psychologically are drawn to different kind of metaphysics and ethics. And he calls this slave morality. And basically, they tend to have this pattern. They say that this lifetime doesn't matter and that it is just a test for another lifetime that matters more. And you should get over yourself instead of believing in yourself, because if you embrace enough humility, then maybe you get the keys to the next life. And so Nietzsche says that slave moralities are life-denying and self-denying. And he says, again, most healthy cultures are a blend of master moralities and slave moralities in different pockets of the culture. But what he thinks has happened to modern culture in the 19th century in Western civilization is that it has been overcome by slave morality. Listen carefully here, because you could take this the wrong way, but he basically thinks that there was a revolutionary figure in the Jewish tradition named Jesus. And Jesus was a radical critic of culture. And as such, Nietzsche has a kind of a begrudging admiration for Jesus. But then some Thrasymachus's, some wolves in sheep's clothing, have taken the radical and rebellious teachings of Jesus and turned them into a slave morality. And they've done it in order to seize power for themselves. But they've done it so effectively that culture has got too much of this in it right now. And the danger of too much slave morality is too many people who are life-denying and self-denying. Because when your metaphysics and your ethics are life-denying and self-denying, you aren't going to strive to change yourself and society. And when too many people give up on changing themselves and society, society stagnates and we drive culture right off the cliff. And Nietzsche is postmodern enough to know that there is no guarantee that Western civilization or even humanity is going to survive. And so what does he propose in response to what he calls modernity as an illness? Modern culture overly infected by slave morality. Well, he says this is where the Socrates, not of rational argumentation, but the Socrates of the examined life, the Socrates that shamed the jury, is called for. Philosophy must be done not with a pen and not with a voice, but with a hammer. Okay, this is Nietzsche. He's over the top, he's bombastic, he's metaphorical. Some of it you'll see is clearly sort of offensive, but he's got a logic to it all and why he does it this way. So he uses the metaphor here of philosophy with a hammer. And he says, what you have to do is be willing to walk into the temples of culture. And you have to take an honest look at the statues representing the values of your culture. And you have to take your hammer and you have to swing as hard as you can at these beautiful statues. This is philosophical critique, and you have to be as aggressive with this as you can, because what Nietzsche says is that if these statues are solid, if what they represent is timely and good and wise, then they will stand up to the critique or the hammer. But if they're hollow, if they're superficial bullshit, if they are just old and outdated, then they must be smashed. The hammer is an important part of the ongoing recreation of the individual and of culture. We must all learn to wield the hammer. We must all seek wisdom with a hammer, because this saying no to some things, what he calls naysaying, then leads to what he calls yay-saying, saying yes. And we must embrace what he calls our biological will to power. Okay, this actually gets appropriated by the Nazis in kind of an ugly way. Nietzsche's sister totally sells him out at the end of his life once he's lost his mind, literally to Hitler after he's dead. And the Nazis appropriate a lot of Nietzsche. And some of his rhetoric lends itself to that, including this. But I don't think it's the right way to understand Nietzsche. Nietzsche says that what defines all life is the will to power. The Nazis understand that as the will to dominate others. But Nietzsche, I think, understands it as the will to outgrow yourself. It's not enough to be alive. You have to embrace the never-ending growth of life. And so you have to overcome yourself by wielding the hammer. You have to overcome the values that got you to this point of despair. You have to overcome the values of culture that got us to this superficial place. And you do that with your naysaying. But the challenge, of course, is always in a moment. And this is a very new challenge, so we're not very good at it. And the challenge has a lot at stake right now, because of what Nietzsche calls the death of God. Now, again, this is a metaphor, and it's meant to be a shocking metaphor. And the reason for that is that Nietzsche thinks most people need a smack in the face. That was his attitude. He thought most people are asleep to life. And ironically, the essence of spirituality is about enlivening us again. And so Nietzsche, the great critic, right, the great infamous pronouncer of the death of God, is actually doing something very spiritual, I would argue, when he says, this is a tough moment to wield the hammer. Because if you willingly wield the hammer in this moment, what you're going to do is risk peering into the abyss of deep space, the abyss of meaninglessness, the abyss of uncertainty, the abyss of the modern crisis, the abyss that we may never figure this out, the abyss of that we may not get through this, that humanity may become extinct, that culture may die out. And so he says, this is particularly terrifying for the herd animal that we are. But if you can do it, if you are strong enough to look into the abyss and wrestle with what he calls nihilism, nothingness, then maybe you'll be strong enough to not be broken by that and give up. The passive nihilist gives up at that point and says, well, there's no ultimate reason, so I give up. And that's either not to be through suicide, or it's heroin, or it's distraction via Netflix. It's some giving up, right? But Nietzsche suggests that we could evolve into something more than we've been as a herd animal. The Untermensch, the underman, the herd animal, could evolve into the Übermensch, the Superman. Another idea that the Nazis misappropriate, calling themselves the super race. But Nietzsche wasn't talking about a race. He mocked all races, right? But what he did was he said, some individuals will have the strength to wield the hammer and to peer into the abyss and still choose to get up tomorrow morning and find something to say yes to. And they will see the death of God for the historical tragedy that it is. We live in the moment where science undercut the metaphysics of our old religious traditions. And so these traditions will evolve or they will go extinct. The brave few within the religious traditions and those within secular society are going to embrace the hammer and then see the abyss and treat it like an empty canvas or give up. If you see the abyss as a canvas, then like an artist, you need to paint what is beautiful to you. And you should trust what makes you feel alive. And you should trust what makes you feel curious. And you should trust what fills you with so much liveness that you're overflowing onto people around you with generosity. And if your life feels dead and boring and unfulfilling and full of despair, get out the hammer, find the right other strong individuals to support you as you walk through the temple, and destroy that old sense of self and destroy those cultural values and recreate them anew. You may be a part of the future, and it's not guaranteed. But like a bold artist, you will honestly see the tragedy of the historical moment, the death of God, the undercutting of the religious traditions, the misappropriation of those same traditions at the hands of Thrasymachus's, right? But you could be a part of the solution. You could make those religious institutions alive again. You could be the volcanoes that spread the lava out again and create new formations. Secular society or religious society. Now, Nietzsche talks about the death of God, but I think what he's talking about here is the death of certainty, because the Übermensch no longer requires certainty. The Übermensch takes authorship and responsibility for the construction of the values that we live by. And that is the challenge I want to leave you guys with as we wrap up the semester. Because I think in some ways it's just become more obviously true that we will renew ourselves and our communities, or we will fail to. And if you find the values that take you forward, don't throw away all the good stuff we did, right? From Aristotle and Plato and Epicurus and all the good, theories of morality that can help to glue us together. All that's not trashed, but find what works from among it and construct some new version of it. And you may be the future. You may be the evolution. You may be human 2.0. Good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Professor.
Come see me
Bye.
if you want to study sometime.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll take some questions, but as always, I wish you well. Stay safe. Go forth and flourish. Have a life. Overflow that life onto everybody around you.
You stole my words. You
So
wanna
now
see
I don't have to read that second entry now. That was what you wrote?
Yes, pretty much.
Nice.
Yes.
Look at you.
Look at you. Oh my God.
That's a fun one.
1 in a million. What?
That's a fun lecture, isn't it?
Everything was amazing.
Hmm.
Everything was amazing. Unbelievable.
Thanks, Lee.
Just, yeah, exceeding everything, that I expected for. Really,
Thank you, Lee.
in every level.
Thanks for making it so, too.
Ah,
Takes a
come on.
community. A Philia Sophia. Right?
yeah.
Friendship, love of wisdom.
So what am I going to do now without my friend?
Well, I'll see you in philosophy club, right?
Yeah. Hopefully,
One day. Yeah.
one day. Okay, I'll visit you after that. You have your hours now? That's like, or you're going home?
What day is today?
Today it's Monday.
Monday. Yes, I do then.
Yes? Okay, good. So I'll talk with you later.
Okay. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks.
Anybody else got any questions? Adios. Adios. All right, then. The last two at the party, Cameron and Jillian.